Thank you, everybody, for joining us at this October meeting of the Advisory Council. And since attendance is on the low side, I think we can devote the time to going around and having quick introductions from members. So I will, I'll start and then I will call out names. So my name is Leonard Diggins, current chair, and I am representing the MBTA Rider Oversight Committee on this council. Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Sudeikis. I'm the vice chair of RTAC, and I also work at RTAP, the Rural Transportation. I'm blanking on who I work for right now. And so, but we do technical assistance nationwide for tribal and rural areas.
Don't worry, Scott. I do that kind of thing all the time. So it's okay. So
assistance program is what I was trying to say.
There you go. Let's see, we're gonna save our guests for last. Franny.
Hi, I'm Franny Osman. I'm here representing Acton, and now that Scott moved to representing RTAP, I keep my eyes open for Crosstown Connect area. I also happen to be on the LRTA, Lowell Regional Transit Authority board, and I'm also an officer of MAGIC, which is our sub-region of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. So just a resident, very involved in various transportation committees. Thanks.
Thank you. More power to you, Franny. And next we have Gail. I get
maybe
from
circle
Gail.
Back to Gail.
Yeah. John Seward.
John Seward, moved Mass.
Okay. Thank you, John. And Andy Reeker.
Good afternoon. Andy Reeker, transit planner at the City of Cambridge.
Great. Thank you, Andy. And Fred Mosley.
Yeah, Fred Mosley representing the American Council of Engineering Companies.
Thank you, Fred. And next we have Owen McDonald.
Owen McDonald, Town of Weymouth traffic engineer.
Great, thank you, Owen. And next we have Skylar.
Pleasant Society of Architects.
Thank you, Skylar. And next we have Susan B.
Hi, I'm a member of the public, and I'm just seeing what it's all about.
Great, thank you. Welcome.
I'm from Bedford.
Okay, great. Thank you, Susan. And happy to have you here. And Todd. Todd
Corain, Transportation Administrator for the Town of Brookline.
Thank you, Todd. And we do have someone on the phone. And so I will send you an ask to unmute if you want to introduce yourself. You're welcome to do so.
I believe this is Barry Steinberg.
Hi, this is Barry Steinberg.
Okay, Barry, thanks for joining us.
I'm going to mute again.
Thanks. Good idea. I'll scroll back up, see if I've missed anyone. I don't think so. So I think we're all set here. So first on our agenda, do you want to run through anything, Matt?
If I could just run through the guidelines just
Sure.
to follow the letter of the law, that'd be good.
Sure.
Yeah. So thank you all for attending. I'm Matt Archer, MPO staff. All participants will join today's meeting with muted microphones, as you may have observed. If you could please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation should you have one, that would be great. Sorry, just letting Laura Wiener in. To participate in this discussion, If you could please select the raised hand function to ask to speak, that would be fantastic. You can find this either at the bottom bar on your screen, depending on the version of Zoom that you're using. It may also be located in the reactions button. And if you're using a very old version of Zoom, you may need to open the chat and click on the 3 dots and you will find the raise hand function there. If you are on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute and unmute yourself. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can contact me via the chat box, marcher@ctps.org, or give me a call at 857-702-3708. Thank you very much, Lynn. Back to you.
Great, and I'll just add to that, if you aren't talking, please mute yourself because we are getting some ambient sounds from at least one person's microphone. So thanks for that. And so first on the agenda is going to be a presentation and Q&A on addressing the needs of regional transportation authorities. And for that, we have Alexis Walls from the Massachusetts Public Health Association and Enrique Pepin from Transportation for Massachusetts, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves further and for maybe Enrique to correct my pronunciation of his last name. So with that, Alexis?
Sure, thanks, Len. Enrique, I'm gonna pass it over to you, but I'm wondering, as far as screen sharing is concerned, is it easier, Enrique, for me to share my screen? Do you want to do that?
Sure, that sounds good.
And then Len, I think you might have to stop sharing your screen in order for me to share mine. Or Matt, I'm not sure who's.
I am screen sharing, thank you. You should be able to just interrupt it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Gotcha. I didn't want to be rude.
No, I appreciate that.
This is your meeting. Got it. Okay, thank you for that. That's really helpful.
Sure.
So yeah, I am gonna pass it over to Enrique, but I just want to make sure that everyone can see okay. So I am going to, hold on. So I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger, and I want you all to tell me, is this okay? Can everyone see this all right on the screen? Okay, great.
Yes.
All righty, Enrique, I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Awesome, thank you, Alexis. Leonard, yes, you did pronounce my last name correctly, so I appreciate that. My name is Enrique Pepin again. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator over at Transportation for Massachusetts, and I have the honor of also being the co-chair of RTAC, which is a different RTAC in comparison to this one. It is the Regional Transit Authority Advocates Coalition, and we have a little bit over 80 members at the moment. These are community groups, human service providers, transportation advocates, and local leaders, and even some writers. We try to provide the group with some strong unified voice so that we can have a strong transit users in RTA service areas across Massachusetts. As mentioned here, we try to uplift the needs of transit users in their community. We share the latest happenings in RTA services. So one of my jobs is to provide any updates that happen in all of the regional transportation authorities so that everyone is up to date with one another. And then finally, we mobilize their community and legislators to support policies that benefit RTA transit users. You go to the next slide. Awesome. So for those of you who don't know, 55% of our population in Massachusetts actually live in the RTA service area. Cities and towns within RTA service areas rely more heavily on the RTA, have a higher proportion of Black and Latinx residents. So when you look at communities like Springfield, Worcester, Lawrence, Brockton, Fall River, New Bedford, these are the communities that we're talking about. And people who rely on RTA services are disproportionately lower income, older, without a car, and disabled. So they are people that they have no other options. They rely on regional transit authorities, and that's it. All right. Some common transit destinations in RTA communities include municipal buildings, schools and universities, places of worship, hospitals, medical centers, shopping areas, social service agencies, office and manufacturing complexes. Okay. Now we want to talk about a little bit of the importance of the RTA during the COVID-19 pandemic. RTAs were essential services to residents across the Commonwealth and are especially crucial during this pandemic. They have allowed our users to allow essential workers to travel to and from job sites, transport residents to medical appointments, including COVID-19 testing sites, and connect low-income residents with essential services like food pantries and grocery stores. Okay, how are RTAs funded? So here we have a nice little graph for you guys, which breaks down how the PVTA, the BRTA, CCRTA, MWRTA, and MBTA are funded in comparison to state funding, local funds, federal assistance, and funding from fair revenues. So if you look at the PVTA, the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority, 51.9% of that comes from the state. But when you compare it to the Cape Cod Regional Transit Authority, that's only 16.1%. So we really look at how differently the RTA budget is break down in each of these regions. And we try to understand what's the reasoning behind this and how can we as the RTAC talk to our legislators so that we can better enhance the budget. Next slide.
And Enrique, can I just add something to this slide as well?
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, the only other thing I would add here is that when you look at across RTAs, right? So we know there are 15 RTAs across the state. And as Enrique mentioned, they vary in terms of, how much they rely upon state funding. One thing is really clear, which is that state funding makes up the largest portion of an RTA's budget. So that is where they get a large majority of money through to support their budgets. And I would just say as well, I think looking at all RTAs across the state, it averages out at about 40% of an RTA's budget comes from annual state funding. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there as well.
Yeah,
I have a question, a procedural question. So how do you want questions? Do you want us to wait until the end or for us to just pop in when we have questions?
I think that if there are questions specific to the content that we're covering, and Enrique, tell me what you think about this. I say just sort of like jump on in and ask. But I think if it's sort of like a bigger picture question, if we can wait till the end for that, that will be great. But if it's sort of like a clarifying question, I think we'd rather you all ask those as they come up.
Okay, then I have two. And so the one is for, I think the previous slide where you said that 55% of the residents may rely on RTAs. So is that reliance on RTA, is that for people who don't have access to the MBTA? Or does that include the MBTA?
So from my understanding, these are people that live primarily in RTA areas that the MBTA does not reach.
Okay, I thought that was the case, but I figured I'd ask the obvious question. And so to the next slide, in response to Alexa's statement about, I guess it's the next one going forward. Yeah. So, but the CCRTA does have, its percent of funding from the state is less, right? It's not like the biggest. The biggest percentage of revenue for them is from fares, right? So I'm just kind of wondering why are they different? And do they have like limited services? Like, is the fact that they're getting so little money from the state limiting the services it can provide so that they're getting more revenue from more funding from revenue, but that's not a good thing? It's just happens to be because they have so little funding from the state.
So Enrique, I'm happy to take a stab at answering that. And if there's anything that I leave out, hop in.
Sure.
So I would say I can't speak to the complexities of why each individual RTA's budget breaks down this way, because that's something that's sort of been that formula has sort of been crafted over time. And so that isn't something I can speak to specifically. What I will say, Leonard, is you're absolutely right. It does vary from RTA to RTA. And that's why I think, I wanted to hop in with that average of like 40%, because even though it does vary from RTA to RTA, if we were to average them all out in how much of each RTA's funding does come from annual contract assistance through the state, does average out at about 40%. I would hazard a guess that for the CCRTA, that has a lot to do with sort of tourism and thinking about, yes, there are absolutely folks in that region who live there year round and who do rely upon RTA services. But we also know that it's an area that receives a lot of tourists. And so it wouldn't surprise me if that is a big reason why they are able to rely a little bit less on state contract assistance and a little bit more on fair revenue.
All right, thanks. That was helpful. Appreciate it.
Of course. Any other question on this particular slide? Another thing to take out from this slide is the fact that, when you compare the RTAs compared to the MBTA, you can see that MBTA has a very big advantage. Obviously, the CCRTA isn't the best example for this, but 46% of its revenue does come from fair revenue to the MBTA, and the RTAs and other communities just don't have that advantage. So they really do depend on state funding. Next slide. Okay, so when we look at some of the challenges that RTAs face in terms of funding, one of the main concerns at RTAC is that funding has been very unpredictable for a very long time. It has fluctuated throughout the years. You can see that in fiscal year 2013, our base funding was of about $80 million. And it has stayed pretty consistent. It went up $2 million in 2015, then it went back down. Then you saw an increase 2019 and 2020. So RTAs just don't know what they're going to have year after year. And that is an unfair situation to be at, because when you look at this graph on the right, the RTAs, they can implement an improvement, but the state could say, oh, you're getting better. So they'll either cut the funds or they would just say that they don't need the funds. And then the RTAs, because of this, are then unable to sustain these implements of improvements. So it's just very unfair. And what we've been asking for the past year and a half is, have a stable source of funding year after year that is consistent and continuously growing, in terms of the economy. And just a quick update, it's not highlighted on this graph on the left, but in fiscal year 2021, the RTAs did receive operating funds worth $90.5 million. And in fiscal year 2022, which just was voted on by the legislature, they got $90.5 million for base operating funds. For those of you who may not be clear with operating funds, this is for service and maintenance. And then an extra $3.5 million distributed on a formula accounting for ridership, population, and geography. A victory in fiscal year 2022 was as there's no more money held back for performance grants. Performance grants was used to look at quality of service of the RTA, the compliance. The RTAs also needed to provide data on ridership, and it also depended on customer service. So obviously, due to the pandemic, we thought that was unfair, and we asked them to get rid of operating funds. Of performance grants, and that was granted to us. Yep, thank you. And then because of the lack of funding in some of these RTAs, we see that most RTAs, they can't afford to have late night services. Some RTAs will run on Sundays or even on weekends in general. Geographic boundaries of the 15 RTAs limit rider mobility, and many rural communities are unserved or marginally served by RTAs. There have been some exciting news lately, such as, the WRTA just started a pilot that is making the trip from Amherst to Worcester much quicker. So we are seeing some improvement and some dedication to interconnectivity. But when we speak to our members down in the SRTA region in Fall River, their commuters, they don't have services on the weekends, or they end very early in the night, that if someone's working a late night shift, they don't have transportation going back home. So these are issues that we try to fight on in every one of our meetings. And it's just something that we try to highlight to the legislator to please increase their funding so that we could, add weekend services and increase services in general. Another issue that we see are environmental and health impacts. To the graph on the left here says that in Springfield, Massachusetts, the asthma prevalence of adults of 18 or older is at an 18.2%. And obviously, when you compare that to the national average of 9%, that is more than double the percentage. And this is due to vehicle emissions that cause pollution and lead to worse health outcomes. That not only cause asthma, but also reduce lung capacity and respiratory illnesses. And most of the RTA buses in the regions are diesel fueled, which contribute to the air pollution, which is why part of the bill that we are going to talk about a little bit later talks about electrification of the bus fleet to try to eliminate that air pollution or just bring the numbers down. We go on to the next slide. And I'll pass it over to my colleague Alexis for this portion of the presentation.
Hey, everybody. So thanks, Enrique. Yeah, as Enrique said, we're going to talk a little bit more about what we do, right? Enrique talked about some of the challenges that we see across RTA communities, but I want to talk a little bit more about one piece of advocacy that our coalition is working on right now, and how you can get more involved in that. But before I go into the details of the bill that we're supporting, or that we helped to draft, I want to talk a little bit more about how we got there. So in 2018, the Task Force on RTA Performance and Funding was created by the fiscal year 19 Massachusetts state budget. And really the purpose of that group was to investigate challenges and opportunities that face regional transit providers in Massachusetts. And I wanted to really draw your attention to a big conclusion that this report made, that this task force made in their final report, which was that if RTAs are going to innovate, they're going to expand, if they're going to improve to meet the needs of residents, they need financial predictability and stability, which Enrique has already shared has not always been the case for RTA communities in Massachusetts. In addition to investment, that core recommendation around investment, there were other recommendations that this report made, some that responded to issues around quality of service, around environmental sustainability, around service decisions. But unfortunately, where we are right now, we've seen, I believe, only one recommendation from that report out of 24 that's been successfully adopted, whereas the remaining recommendations have either been slow to implement or they haven't yet been acted upon. And so earlier this year, our coalition came together and decided that we wanted to change that, right? That we wanted to work with legislative champions to file a bill that would hopefully help to move forward some key recommendations from this task force report. And so that is what we want to share with you today. So this bill is Senate Bill 2277 and House Bill 3413. Our legislative champions are Senator Harriet Chandler and Representative Natalie Blais. So I'm just going to talk about 6 provisions in the bill, and I'm going to break each one down to just share a little bit more information. I'm also actually going to pop into the chat a fact sheet that we have on the bill so that you all are able to follow along with us here. So give me a quick second to put that in the chat. Okay. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about what this bill would actually do. One of the big pieces that we've talked about is investment, right? Like if we want to see RTAs actually advance, we have to be willing to invest in them. And so that's one of the biggest things that this bill would do. The first thing that it would do is it would ensure adequate funding for RTAs. So as we mentioned, RTAs do get on average a significant portion of their operating funds from the annual state budget. But when the operating assistance from the state is unpredictable, as it has been, and when it doesn't increase along with the cost of operating, RTA planning and budget processes are negatively impacted, which in turn then hurts the writer. And so this bill would actually set a $94 million floor for state contract assistance in fiscal year 22, which we're in right now. And it would include annual automatic increases that are based on inflation. The good news here is that our coalition and other partners were successful in pressuring the legislature to allocate $94 million towards RTA state contract assistance, which is great. But we still want to see an annual inflator included in legislation, because that's the only way we can guarantee that funding for RTAs will increase in a predictable way from year to year. This bill would also dedicate a portion of Uber and Lyft fees to support RTAs. So, we've talked about the annual state budget, but the MBTA, as some of you may know, doesn't just get money from the annual state budget. They also have a dedicated source of revenue in the sales tax. And so we believe that RTAs also need a dedicated source of revenue. And so what we're pushing for in this bill is that 50% of transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, that 50% of those fees that are currently in the Commonwealth Transportation Fund would actually go towards RTAs. I do want to note that this bill would not require, if passed into law, it would not require an increase in Uber and Lyft fees. There are other bills that have been filed this session that would do that if passed, but that's not what this bill does. What this bill says is essentially what the state currently gets from transportation network companies, 50% of that's in the Commonwealth Transportation Fund would go towards RTAs, and the other 50% will go towards the MBTA, as opposed to risking some of that money automatically going to projects like roads and bridges, which are important, but we know that transit is also really important and is often not invested in enough. This bill also has some things to say about accountability. So right now, we know that each RTA is managed and operated through its own organizational processes, but we as advocates want to see greater collaboration between RTAs, MassDOT, and riders of the RTAs. And so currently, the RTA Council, which is different than this, this RTA Council, but currently the RTA Council is comprised of representatives from the RTAs, MassDOT, and the MBTA, and they meet on a regular basis to share best practices. We want to see a revitalization of the RTA Council. And so this bill would actually increase rider representation on the council, because currently there is none. And it would support service improvements by requiring the council to put out an annual report on TA and service needs of RTAs to MassDOT. So an annual report would be required. And we think that this would really help the council play a greater role in not only uplifting the needs of RTA communities, but also working towards a collective vision for statewide transportation. Another thing that this bill would do is it would enhance support for RTA capital projects. So, if we want to keep RTA fleets in good repair and we want to support new technologies, RTAs require more funding for capital projects. And so what this bill would do is it would establish parity between RTAs and the MBTA, where state capital funds are used as a match for federal funds. This bill, as Enrique mentioned, also has some implications for electrification of RTA buses. Enrique already talked about the fact that a majority of RTA buses, still run on diesel fuels, which is highly polluting. And this bill would direct MassDOT to support RTAs in the development of comprehensive bus plans. And then lastly, this bill also has implications for fare collection. So this bill would require MassDOT to cease or stop grading RTAs on the fare box recovery ratio, which is a performance metric used to measure how successful an RTA is by comparing how much of their operating budget is covered by what they collect in fare revenue. So it's basically measuring RTAs on how profitable they are. And this bill would end use of that ratio, because we do believe that it deepens inequities by incentivizing fare policies that actually burden riders. So I'm going to pause there and just see if there are any questions that folks have, like any clarifying questions, before we just share a couple of highlights from testimonies of some of our advocates, and then talk a little bit more about how you all can actually help to advance this bill through the legislature. And I can't see raised hands super well with my screen.
Yeah, I'm looking for that. I mean,
Okay,
I'll call out folks. I mean, I certainly have some questions and maybe statements, but I'm going to wait until the very end, because you may answer some of them.
Sure.
No questions. So you can keep going. Thanks.
Alrighty, sounds good. So these are just some quotes from some of our advocates during a hearing that we actually had July 22nd. And so one of our advocates says that some of our most vulnerable residents make life-changing decisions based on RTA routes. And just mind you, this is a hearing on the RTA advancement bill. So all of these testimonies were provided to support the RTA advancement bill. Another advocate shared that most of us cannot or do not drive. He's talking about riders in the Worcester area where he lives and where he utilizes RTA services. Our greatest fear is that one day our bus stop or route will disappear. We are the victims of a misguided campaign MassDOT calls greater efficiency. Another advocate shared that having the ability to incorporate the temporary pilot programs, and she's referencing pilot programs in the Franklin County region where she works and lives. Having the ability to incorporate temporary pilot programs into the regular operation of the FRTA through increased dedicated funding would allow more people to re-enter or enter the workforce and attend secondary education. And then lastly, one of our partners over at the Massachusetts Public Interest Research Group shared that this bill will help RTAs electrify their fleets to help improve air quality in RTA communities where, like Worcester and Springfield, where asthma rates are some of the highest in the state of Massachusetts. Alrighty. So lastly, we just sort of want to leave you all with some clear next steps and how you could actually take action to support this bill and help us advance it through the legislature. The first thing you could do is call or email your legislator today and ask them to co-sponsor the RTA advancement bill. And so we can put in the chat a link to find your legislator, and then also a link where you can see who's co-sponsored the bill thus far. But you all are in a wonderful position because many of you are actually, or some of you, at least from my understanding, are in the MBTA service area, or at least know folks who are. And while we definitely have support from the RTA caucus on this bill, there are some folks outside of RTA service areas who we really want to support this bill as well. Because as Enrique mentioned, yes, this may be very specific to RTA communities, but we know that 55% of Massachusetts residents live in an RTA service area. So this would impact the majority of Massachusetts residents. You can also submit written testimony in support of the RTA advancement bill, and we have a template that we can provide you that makes that process really easy. And then lastly, if you're interested in keeping up with our meetings and learning more about some of the other advocacy that we're doing, you can sign up for the RTA Advocates email list, where you get updates on big action items and ways that you could sort of plug into this work and help move it forward. And I think that is all she wrote.
Thank you. And so I'm just looking to see if there are any questions. All right, and I'll try and keep an eye on the hands, and Matt will help me out while I ask some questions. So, um, so uh, what has been? Do you know the experience that some of your members have had in the Boston area with their interactions with the Boston Region MPO? Because my impression is that our MPO kind of makes an effort to work with the RTAs.
Sure. So I might need you to I might need you to repeat that question again, Leonard. So you're
Sure.
saying what has the response essentially of folks in Boston been to this bill? Is that what you're asking?
No, no, no. I guess no, that's not what I'm asking. I guess let me rephrase it. Do you have a sense of what the Boston Region MPO can do to help the RTAs in our region more?
Sure. So you're saying for folks who are for folks who have those connections with legislators in like the greater Boston area, what can you be doing to further this work on like in working to support this bill?
No, because I think because as I mentioned, when we talked, it isn't so much that we as a group will advocate for a bill. As individuals we can,
Sure.
and certainly I appreciate that. Really, what I'm trying to get at here is what is it that the Metropolitan Planning Organization, because we're the advisory council to the MPO, and so I'm trying to tease out, is there something more that you're hearing from your members that maybe an entity like us could do, to support RTAs? So regardless what happens with this bill, what is it that maybe we can do? And we can advocate to our board, that we do more for RTAs with respect to funding. Especially when it comes to things like the community connections, and also the MPO has started this transit working group, and I know that it does some work with RTAs. So I'm just trying to get a sense of what more we can do. And if the answer is I don't know, then just know that we are a resource, and that you can work with us.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks for breaking that down. I know we spoke about the specific charge of this group, but it's something that honestly, that's helpful to have that reminder. Yes, so I absolutely think funding is really big. I think there are partners who are part of our coalition who perhaps would be interested in participating in projects that would increase access to transportation in RTA communities, especially thinking about rural areas where, it may not make the most sense to have fixed route service, but like where microtransit is an option. So I think funding is definitely, advocating for more funding to support organizations in RTA communities who can help to fill some of those gaps, or who can work with their RTA to fill some of those gaps is always really helpful. Enrique mentioned earlier, like interregional connectivity, and outside of, increased operating funds for RTAs, that consistently comes up as the second most important priority for our group, is thinking about interregional connectivity, because it doesn't make sense that folks who are in the same region are unable to get from one city or town to another just because, RTA services don't quite connect, right, in a way that allows them to do that. So I think certainly funding, attending some of our meetings every once in a while, or honestly, going to meetings like you all do with the RTA Council to learn about some of the pilots that are happening, because I think there are opportunities for more pilots, or to, like, folks are looking for funding to sustain pilots beyond like the 1 year, 2 year period that they receive funding for initially. So I think that's another way. Does that answer the question, Leonard?
Yeah, it does. And I guess kind of a corollary to the question is, do you know if RTAs and other metropolitan planning organizations are working with their MPOs?
I'm not sure of. I'm not sure about that.
Because one thing I've become really aware of, by virtue of my work with the council here, and both as chair and outside of being chair, is just how MassDOT has a seat on all of the MPOs, and I really appreciate the extent to which I feel that the leaders and those higher up the chain in MassDOT, and even those lower down, kind of view the whole system comprehensively, if I can be redundant. And so to the extent there's a gap in kind of coordination amongst the RTAs, I'm kind of wondering why is that the case, what's preventing folks from working on that gap. So it's just not really clear to me who to reach out to other than maybe someone like Ben Mullins. So I just feel that I hope this bill works. And I support it. But regardless, I think there's stuff that we can do that's just not being done, or maybe I'm just missing something. So that's more of a statement than a question, but it is a desire to try to work on this, and also to encourage you or any member of your group to become members of us, and to the extent that the other advisory councils have groups like us, then try to become part of those groups so that you can bring your concerns to the respective advisory councils, which can then make sure that those concerns are heard at the respective boards. So it's invitation, and don't worry, I'll offer the invitation repeatedly, so you'll be hearing from me. So I was like, I haven't heard from you. Where's your members? You want someone else at the table, So that gave people time to want to ask a question. And
Len, I am seeing a hand raised from Mr. Andy Rieger.
Okay, thanks. I couldn't see it. Thank you.
No worries.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Len. Thank you, Enrique, and thank you, Alexis. The presentation is really good. I actually have a question in terms of kind of the bill that's at play, and maybe it's more of a clarification question there. So I think one of the things that I think you brought up in the presentation was kind of the gaps between maybe the MBTA's bus network and the RTAs, or between the different RTAs, and how there's, clearly transportation needs that could be met by public transit in those areas. So I know fundings just seems to be one of the major pieces that I think this bill accomplishes. Maybe is there a part of the bill that actually gets at kind of the planning for and kind of the schedule, essentially figuring out what are the routes, what are the schedules, how do we get these two RTAs to talk to each other, or how do we get the MBTA and the RTA to talk to each other, and not just talk to each other because the council is clearly there, but like actually work together. And I think that the Worcester and the PVTA kind of combined route is a really great initiative that shows that it can happen. But I'm curious whether the bill has a piece that not just encourages it, and maybe actually heavily encourages it to actually start resulting in new routes or fixing these gaps. And if not, where is the kind of, where's the next step on that piece?
That's a great question, Andy. Enrique, I don't know, do you want me to take the first stab at that, or do you want to?
Yeah, take the first stab, just because that's one of the parts that I'm not too clear on myself.
Okay. Yeah. So this bill, that's a really good question, Andy. And I think we see that part of the bill be resting with the RTA Council and just thinking about what the RTA Council can be, right? Like, we know that the RTA Council shares a lot of best practices, but is there like an annual report that the council can be working on together to put out that really like uplifts some of the biggest needs? And in that space, maybe there is, because, RTAs will do their, their comprehensive.
That's with the 2-run home run of the fourth.
RTAs will put out their comprehensive service assessments, every 5 years or so, and they'll talk about some of the greatest needs within their RTA service area. But I think encouraging that reporting on an annual basis at the council level allows for some of those like gaps to rise to the top, right? And like, oh, okay, CERTA, you and GATRA, like this is a really clear area where the two of you should be working together. And hopefully with that council space being a space where MassDOT is also present, it creates an opportunity to, like at a certain point, you continue to report on something, action has to follow up, right? Like, and so I think that is our hope, is that encouraging an annual report at the council level on RTA technical assistance needs and service needs, that will allow for more talking, more planning across RTAs, and then hopefully the funding that's needed to actually implement some of those long-term service changes that are needed.
Yeah, I think just as a comment, I'm glad to hear that that's kind of the hope. I think one of the things, this predates my time at Cambridge and actually predates the time that I've been living here in the Boston metropolitan region, but I know that the Boston Region MPO and the MBTA went through a process maybe almost 20 years ago of really thinking about suburban transit and really focusing on where are there's some corridors of bus service that might be, pretty reliable. And, it takes a long time to build up a strong suburban transit constituency, right? And I think in the RTAs, it's probably similar kind of transportation options, right? Buses that run very infrequently, your trips may take a while. And so I think that the public transit problem is very similar. But because similarly, those suburban transit routes were also highly focused on fare recovery and not so much about the service that they provide to the riders that ride them, they got pretty easily cut when it came to budget kind of whenever there was a budget crisis at the T. So I'm very aware of how cyclical sometimes these conversations can be in terms of the problems kind of reappear. I guess the just general question is like, is there another piece that's just talking about additional funding for transit, regardless of whether it's RTA or MBTA? The MBTA has its pretty solid, sales tax piece, but just, shifting from so much of a highway and roadway focus to, evening the playing field between the two, and whether this bill accomplishes it, or whether, again, we kind of need to look to a different bill or a different kind of initiative to actually have that conversation.
Yeah, you're so right? Like this issue, it's huge. Like the problem is really big, and it is not possible to address it all with this one bill. This bill, even though we think that it's a great idea, we would love to see it pass. We make no mistake that like this is the solution, right? That this is like the piece to the puzzle that's needed. I think there are additional pieces of legislation or other efforts that are sort of in the works that we hope can be a part of this larger puzzle, right? Like we have, all of these funds that have come down from the feds for a pandemic relief and recovery that can be used to sort of like, at least in the meantime, help to fill some of these gaps. We have, this is me taking off my hat as RTAC co-chair, because this is not necessarily something that the RTAC has like put out a position on, but the Fair Share Amendment, right? Thinking about how we can increase taxes for millionaires in this country in order to put more towards education and transportation, right? Like there are different policy initiatives that are that advocates are working towards that we think all sort of fit together in this bigger puzzle of thinking about what we can do to increase funding for transit. There's also the federal infrastructure package and like bill that we hope will come down soon, that could increase funding for transit as well. So I think this is like a piece of the puzzle. I don't think that it's the full, it's not the full puzzle. It's not what we need to fix all of these issues that we're raising. We just think it helps us take a step towards a step in the right direction, if that makes sense.
Thank you. So a couple more questions that popped to mind. Your federal money, does that come through the state and gets allocated to the RTAs by a formula, or do you get it directly from the feds?
So RTAs get their own, so I'm not sure, I think it depends on what we're talking about. If we're looking at, for example, like federal recovery and relief funding, most RTAs, with the exception of some rural RTAs, receive that directly from the Fed. That does not go through the state first. It goes directly to the RTAs. And I believe that's the case for most sources of federal funding, that most of like the urban RTAs receive that directly from the Fed. I think it's typically the rural RTAs that it goes through MassDOT, or there's some process that has to happen, or some like step in between like the Fed and the actual rural RTAs. That's my understanding.
And how does access disability access factor in into the services you provide and the cost?
So when we talk about RTA services and when we talk about increasing funding for RTAs, we are talking about both fixed route and paratransit services.
Okay. All right.
And that's something that we should have mentioned or incorporated in one of the slides. In another presentation that we do where we just talk about what the RTAs are, we sort of outline both of those types of services. And so, you know, any funding that we're talking about, increasing funding for RTAs, we're talking about increasing funding or support or thinking about, you know, planning and service needs, not just for fixed route buses, but also for paratransit services.
Right.
And I will say as well that the 2019 task force report that came out had a section as well specific to paratransit services and some of the needs. And I can share that out with you all so that folks can take a look. But paratransit services are definitely not left out in any of these conversations.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. If we could drop that report into the chat, and then other people can have access to it, because I think it'll be good. And really, please do keep in touch, because we get caught up in our cycles of things that are going on. I mean, before long we'll be caught up in the Unified Planning Work Program cycle, and close on the heels of that will be the Transportation Improvement Program cycle, and I think we're going to launch the Long Range Transportation Plan cycle next month. And so we have our rhythm, and sometimes we can get a little myopic, and so it'll be really good to have, like I said, really welcome members from your group, but let's do keep in touch, because this is important, and like I said, regardless of what happens with legislation, I think there are things we can do. So with that, can
I just say one more thing, Leonard? Sorry.
Sure. No problem.
I apologize. I know I'm taking up a lot of time.
No. I allotted more time. I knew it was gonna be more than 20. I knew it's gonna be more than 20 minutes. So that's cool.
So no, the only other thing that I would just add is I know that you all as a body cannot advocate for this piece of legislation, like that you have your limits. But I would just really encourage folks, if this is something that, if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to either Enrique or myself, and we can talk about them. If there are any other suggestions you have, but I would say most of all, if this is something that you would like to support, please help us move this forward in the legislature, help us get more co-sponsors for the bill, and join our listserv. And so I will, Leonard, we'll kind of follow up with some of those next steps that it's easy for you to just sort of like copy paste in your follow-up email. But yeah, thank you all again for your time and for your engagement. Much appreciated.
Sure, and if you can, throw in the list of names on RTAC caucus, because to the extent they are more local folks, then some of us will have the ability to reach out to them effectively, because, you know, it's most helpful when you're reaching out to your own representative. So if we throw that list in, we probably recognize some of them and can do something, or at least can contact them. Alrighty. Thank you. So I think we can move on. And next on the agenda is this is in the part where if you're like watching a soap opera, at least this would do this when my mom was watching them, playing the role of Matt Genova is Leonard Diggins. So I'll be giving the presentation that I was hoping Matt could give, but Matt is doing important development process program today. So he's giving me the presentation. Essentially what I wanted to do is go through that draft policy for handling cost increases, project cost increases. I had given a quick summary of what was going to be released, and this is what has been released. And I think the link to it was included in the listing for today's meeting. But I'm going to go through Matt's presentation a little bit on the quick side. And so if you have questions, feel free to jump in with the questions. Don't wait until the end. And as I go through it, I would like for us to think about whether or not we want to make a statement. And we have until the 18th. And we will not be creating a committee for it. But if at the end of this, we decide that we want to make a statement, then I think we can come up with the framework for that statement, and then allow whoever wants to author it and then submit it. Alternatively, and as I said last time, we as individuals, can make statements anytime we want. So hopefully going through this will help you become more informed about it. And if you want to make your own statement in support or whatever, feel free to do so. So with that, we'll launch into the presentation. You're going to see me looking off because I can see things better, maybe from another computer that I have here, and Matt Archer will be controlling what you see. And so with that, so this is, and I'm gonna kind of read from this slide mostly. So it's a three-pronged approach. We want to require more advanced design status at project programming. Second, we want to create additional touch points between the project proponents, MPO staff, and the MPO board and MassDOT staff. And thirdly, we want to establish a policy for rescoring projects when the costs change beyond a specified threshold. Next. And this, let me see something. It's a little different than, okay. Your recommendation one, and that's a little different than, okay. You definitely have something different than what I have, Matt.
My apologies. I think due to my issues with PowerPoint, this may not be the exact version that you were looking at. This was taken from the last MPO presentation. Here, if you can give me one moment, I can, oh, you know what? Yeah, if you give me one moment, I will be able to get that other presentation up.
Okay.
Ideally,
yeah, it's just because I just can't read this one. That's the problem. It's like fully
understand.
Yeah.
So to be clear, you are referring to the MPO presentation, not the most recent TIP project cost ad hoc committee meeting.
It's the deck that Genova sent both of us yesterday. It's a PowerPoint.
That is the one, except clearly I have the PDF of the wrong version.
Oh.
So here, we're going to try this one more time.
Sure. If you can't do PowerPoint, then what I can do is I could generate a PDF from the PowerPoint that he sent me.
Oh, yeah. I think we actually might be good to go.
All right.
Okay. So can folks see that? I'm not entirely sure why the agenda is blank, but can everyone see this though?
Yeah. Okay. So so go one more slide.
Yep.
And yeah, it's matching what I have. All right. Cool. And so if we back up to the process, so back up one more slide.
Yep.
Yeah, there we go. So this was the general process. It was created. This ad hoc committee was created in 2021, and when we became aware of the problems that we're going to have with respect to funding any programs. This is April 2021, and actually we were aware of it before then, but then we proposed that we create a committee like this, and that's when the committee was created in April 21, and it had 9 MPO board members, the MEPC chair Eric Barassa, MassDOT Highway Division, don't recall who that was, the Advisory Council, us through me, MBTA Advisory Board, Brian Kane, and 5 municipalities, Boston, Everett, Medway, Rockland, and Somerville. And we also had participation from the FHWA, MassDOT, and OTP. So it was a good bunch. I mean, and as I said at the board meeting, it could have been any subset of us, and it would have been a good group because that's just how I feel about the composition of the current board. Next slide. So the timeline is what it is. I mean, and we're at the point now where we are reviewing the draft. Next. And now we get to the meat of the matter. So these were the problem areas that were identified. Sorry to be a little repetitive to what I read earlier. First is a high degree of cost uncertainty early in the project design. 2, a lack of definition and approach to handling cost changes. 3, a limited proponent engagement outside annual TIP development process. And 4, unclear expectations for proponents after project programming. Next. So what we realize is that there are differing levels of cost changes by design stage. So at the 25% design stage, you can see that the cost changes are between 30 and 40%, depending on whether you're looking at the median or the mean. At 75% design, it's in the 20 to 15% range. And at 100% design, it's at the 10% range for both average and median. And you may notice in the total column that it isn't an additive of the other 3 sets. I talked with Matt about this, and that's because the other 3 columns are mostly it's a sampling issue more than it is a selecting of the projects that are included. So if that's not completely clear, I'm sorry about that. It's a poor explanation on my part, but when he explained it to me, it makes sense. I'm sorry if I'm not conveying it to you in a way that makes sense. That's my bad. Next. And so this is the more important one and the more relevant one for us, and that is when the cost increases that we see when we put a project into the TIP. When we've put projects into the TIP, when they're simply at the PRC stage, and that's the project review stage, then we generally see fairly large cost increases, and it ranges from 94% to 70%, depending on whether you're looking at the average or the median. Whereas if we put projects into the TIP at the 25% design stage, then you can see, the cost increases are roughly 25%. And interestingly, when you get to the 75% design stage, I guess not only are the cost increases very small, and they can even be a decrease. So, but of course, it takes a lot for a community to get to 75% design stage, and they really do need to have some sense of commitment from the MPO that we are going to move forward with their project, which is the whole reason for generally getting the project into the TIP earlier. Next. And this is just a distribution of the cost changes, and it's an interesting slide. I'm not going to dwell on it long because I think there's nothing in it that will change the way you feel about the conclusions that we make one way or another. And I think we'll be able to make this available to people too. So next. So this is an interesting chart because it shows the cost increases and the project development timelines, just trying to get a sense as to how the cost increases correlate with the amount of time it takes to get a project done. And as you can see, some of these projects have some pretty long timelines. And if you can read it, at the far right, there's an R square that is 0.01, which is saying that only 1% of the cost increases can be attributed to the amount of time of development. And this is something that really popped out at me when it became clear that I was going to have to do this little presentation myself, was that you have 3 kind of outliers there, I asked Matt what they were being, and they are. I think one's a complete street project. I mean, the other ones are kind of small, and so you're talking. I mean, like maybe a $2 million project that went to 4 million. I mean, I think the complete streets project we ended up around 29 million. I mean, so um, yes, the percent increase is huge, I mean, but the amount of dollars overall wasn't huge. And if you take them out, I mean, I'm not quite sure what your R square would look like. I think it would probably still be on the small side, but more importantly to me is if you cut that sample down, I mean, to like maybe 70 months, I mean, instead of 100 months, I mean, then you find yourself now with a decreasing trend line, you know, which I think would have an R square, meaning that is significantly higher. I don't know what to make of that. You know, at this point, I mean, it's kind of far down the road, and once again, I don't think it really have any bearing on the conclusions that we have made as a body with respect to what we put made for recommendations. But I just thought I'd point that out because, well, I'm getting to the presentation and not Matt. Next. So this is the tip benchmarking for the current MPO projects. I mean, and you can see the extent to which we have those that are put in simply with PRC approval versus those that have been put in with 25% approval, and those that are at 75% approval, and those that are 100%. And so it's just data to show you how, at what stage we put them in. Next. So the key takeaways from our early work is that the cost increase problem was pervasive, at least enough to stop us from programming anything this cycle. The largest cost increases occur between PRC approval and the 25% design stage, and there is no strong relationship between overall costs, overall project timeline, and magnitude of cost increase. And for the limited monitoring of project progress until there is limited monitoring of project progress until the deadlines approach. And for that fourth one, there was no data that was presented in the previous slides, and to tell you that that's just what we know from practice. Next. Recommend solutions. So this is a three-prong approach. I mean, I read them earlier. I'll read them quickly again. Require more advanced design status at project programming. 2, create additional touch points between project proponents, MPO staff, MPO board, and MassDOT staff. And 3, establish a policy for rescoring projects when costs change beyond a specified threshold. And we'll go into more detail, of course. Next. Okay, let me just quickly read this over again. So the proposed policy requires that a project reach 20% design submission and obtain updated cost estimate prior to programming. And so this is just showing you where you generally get, where the approval process falls with respect to the design submission. And essentially we are saying that we will program projects only once they get to that 25% design submission. The approval in the public hearing are a little different, and they can take a bit longer. And so with the desire to have a good sense of what we need to, what funds we'll have available for allocating, the decision was to go with the 25% design submission, with understanding that when the rubber kind of hits the road with the public at the hearing process, and there can be substantial changes made then, but the decision of from the advice of CTPS and the consensus of the group was that it was better to do it at the submission stage rather than waiting until the hearing stage. Next. And so We want to formalize the preliminary project evaluation step at PRC approval to offer proponents guidance on how their projects score before investing in the design, and then to establish additional year-over-year benchmarks for project design process to set clear expectations up front, and 3, create additional instruction materials for the TIP process to support proponents. And the part of this is more so to communicate to the proponents, so as to prevent the cost overruns from misunderstandings. One thought about what causes the price increases is that proponents will plan up to the final number that they see allocated to them in the TIP, without taking into account that there are other things that they need to that will factor into their costs, like police details, and I can't think of the other factors, but things like police details. So we just need to make it clear to them what goes into the cost of the project, so that they aren't surprised when they get to a point later on in the process and then they find that their project is over budget, and because we haven't allocated the monies to them that they expect. Next. So the key reasons for proposed project is that the 25% design is the first full engineering review of the project by MassDOT. 2, it eliminates most significant project cost increase issues based on historical data. And 3, provides clear, familiar guideline for project proponents. Next. So recommendation number 2 is to expand stakeholder engagement. And so the proposed policy is to expand engagement of key TIP stakeholders by 1, establishing biannual check-ins between MPO staff, project proponents, and MassDOT Highway District staff. 2, encouraging proponents to include MPO staff on design submissions to MassDOT. And 3, requiring proponent presentations to MPO when there are major project costs or scope changes. And I would add to that, if I were going to make an independent statement, perhaps, is that we should not simply encourage them, but maybe strongly encourage them to include MPO staff on design submissions that they make to MassDOT. But if they're not going to do that, then we should get the information from MassDOT ourselves, so that we know what they're submitting and have a good understanding, a better understanding. Next. And so the key reasons for this proposed policy is to provide the MPO board with more complete, timely information to make decisions. 2, supports proactive conversations between all parties to address problems before they impact the project schedule or costs. And 3, fosters greater proponent accountability for the project. I don't think I need to go into that anymore. Next. So this one is probably the more interesting of them. The most interesting of them. So rescoring project cost increase. The proposed policy establish a multi-step process to address project cost increases. 1, set a cost increase threshold of 2.5 million or 25% of a project cost. And that's for some of your smaller projects, like some of your bike paths, or you never cross the 2.5 billion threshold, and so it's going to be pretty much whatever number is lower, 2.5 million, 25%. And the second point is proponents of projects that exceed either threshold must attend MPO meeting to explain the cost of the cost increase. And the project score can be updated and the new cost score plotted using the 4-quadrant approach, which I think we're going to see next. Yes. And so this is a way of the MPO trying to do some cost benefit analysis. And so tier 1 would be your projects that have high scores and low costs. The second tier would be the projects that have a lower score but low cost. The well, this is interesting. We have two tier twos. All right, maybe it's a typo. Or maybe I don't understand why Matt did it that way. And so the tier two in the upper right is your high score and high cost projects, and tier three is the high cost and low score. So tier three are the least desirable projects. Tier one are the most desirable projects. And I guess tier two and the tier twos, I can see how they're kind of equal in that if they don't cost much and the benefit is close enough to your threshold, they're worth it. And for the tier two, in the upper right, if they're really good and they cost a lot, they're still worth doing. So, but tier one is really what I think would all want more of. And I just want to say that the lines that you see for the costs on the vertical line for the cost and the horizontal line for the points, those are just for examples at this point. Those numbers have not been decided, and that is something that we will have to decide. And I think you should really think about that a lot. It's like, where should those lines go? And is it clear to us how to draw those lines? And yeah, think about that, and maybe we can discuss that afterwards, and decide if that is something that we as a group want to make comments about. And certainly you as individuals, once again, can make comments. Next. And this is just to show you how a point can move from one tier to another if its costs increase. And next. So the third point is rescoring when the costs increase. So in response to presentation rescoring, the MPO board may elect to make changes to the project status, also considering 1, cost score and status of other projects, 2, availability of funds in any given federal fiscal year, 3, past costs or readiness issues for project in question, and 3, distribution of funds across MPO investment programs. Next slide. So this is a continuation of the rescoring. 4, decisions made by the MPO on a project status may include MPO funding of cost increase in the current federal fiscal year, 2, MPO funding of cost increase in another federal fiscal year, 3, denial of MPO funding at the increased cost with a request that the proponent seek alternative funding sources to cover cost difference or value engineer the project to reduce the cost increase. And lastly, the removal of the project from the MPO's TIP, which I think would probably be the very last resort, unless they didn't come to talk to us during any of the opportunities that we provided to them to talk with us about the project. Continuing on recommendation number 3, the proponents may request that the MPO reconsiders its decision via written or oral comments. 6, rescoring would occur during development of a new TIP or amendment of the existing TIP. And 7, the MPO may suspend the scoring process if exceptional circumstances arise. And that's just to say that we're going to allow some flexibility. We understand that there can be extenuating circumstances, the pandemic being one of them. And so if we start getting supply chain issues, that really cause the cost of materials to go up in a way that no one could have predicted, then of course we're going to suspend the rescoring process. And probably some other aspects of recommendation number 3 to keep our commitment to the project. Because after all, I mean, this is simply a commitment to a project in the abstract. I mean, it's a commitment to the people that would benefit from having the project done. Next, the reasons for this proposed policy is: one, it provides the board with more complete, timely information to understand cost increases. Two, it maintains the MPO's flexibility to make decisions with qualitative and quantitative information. And three, it provides proponents with clear guidance on the process for addressing cost increases. Next. Some other recommendations to introduce additional cost-effective measurements such as cost per mile or cost per user in programming conversations. Two, it leads to 4% inflation rate as is for now, with the option to reassess if necessary after other new policies are implemented. And that's there because I had raised the question as to why don't we do compounded inflation, as it seems like everyone does, except for it seems like MassDOT, and that I won't say except. I'm not saying that MassDOT's the only state organization that does this or the only state that does it, but in the business world that I'm used to dealing with, I mean, it's all compounded, because that just seems to be what reality is based on. And it seems like the 4% is just an easy way to estimate the cost. And you can make the argument that over 5 years, there's not going to be much divergence between linear, mean, and compounded. And so, I mean, I don't feel strongly about this, I mean, but I was just trying to understand why it's different. And when I asked why MassDOT does it the way they do it, the only answer I got was that, well, we don't have to do it that way as in the MPO board. But I just wanted to know why MassDOT does it the way it does it, and I just haven't gotten an answer to that, and I'll try and find out. And the third point is continue the MPO practice of allocating all available TIP funds, and that is in response to the desire some of us to keep some money in reserve, so that if there are cost overruns, we're not scrambling. But the hope is that even with immediate implementation, which is the last of these, that it will be effective immediately in stopping the unexpected cost increases, such that it would affect the TIP in such a way that we'd have to push things around like we have done in previous years, because this isn't simply that we ran out of money this year. We had no money to allocate this year, but in the previous two cycles that I've been involved with, we have had to really scramble and push things around, even as we allocated funds because of cost overruns. So that's that. And it was fast, and it probably generated some questions that are required for explanation, but I'm happy to answer the questions as best I can. So if there's anything in the chat, let me know, Matt. Otherwise, I'm going to switch over to participants and look for some raised hands.
Thanks, Len. I will say that John Seward said that project scoring should. Actually, John, do you want to maybe unmute yourself and explain this fully? I believe this is reference to the 4-quadrant approach, but I'm just not fully sure.
Yeah, please, John.
Yes, when this was presented in committee previously, I asked why there were 2 tier 2s. That's never done in academia or research or any other professional setting I've ever seen. And high cost, high return projects are clearly quite different from low cost, low return projects. So there should not be any implied equivalency between them.
All right. Well, thanks for that, John. And so when you asked that, what was the answer?
I never got an answer.
So you asked it verbally and you didn't get an answer? Or you did just not
No,
get a
I
satisfactory?
asked it in chat
Oh, you
and
asked it in chat, yeah.
never saw any reply.
Okay,
I
all
have
right.
to say that I approve entirely of this process. And where it's come down, I'm not sure it's 100% perfect. But it's getting us to a place where when a project qualifies into the TIP, it's been properly scored, it's been properly costed, and then we can hopefully see projects that don't slip into and out of the TIP or advance up in schedule or slip behind in schedule the way that we have in prior years. I think it's been unfair to communities and projects, as well as to the committee and to the public, that we've had such rapid change in the status of TIP qualified projects. So this is a step to move us forward.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Yeah, it's funny because one of the problems that I have often, especially if I don't get the presentations in advance, is that it is just really hard for me to read the screen. And this was an issue that I had before we started Zoom. It's like I don't have good vision, and so even when we're in a room, just seeing in fact, it was even worse. When we're in a room, because a lot of times I just couldn't get positioned to a screen close enough to be able to read it carefully. So I always really wanted the presentations either in advance so that I could just go over them, and have my questions lined up, and often have my questions answered before I get to the meeting, because I could think it through and go, oh, I don't need to ask that question. I figured it out. But yeah, it's funny because I guess all along I was seeing 4 quadrants and I was just seeing 4 tiers. And it wasn't until I had to do the presentation that I saw that there are two tiers. And I started to ask Matt about that this morning when I talked with him about the presentation. I just forgot until I got to this point. So yeah, I agree. Those 2 quadrants are qualitatively different. But we realize they're qualitatively different, regardless of what they're called. And also, with respect to that last part about do we want like other metrics? If we're doing our cost benefit analysis, like cost per person, cost per mile, I think those are worth considering. But I also feel that we have so much scoring going on already, and I think it's a really good set of criteria that we've created, that we can do cost benefit analysis across in so many ways. It's really a matter whether we want to formalize it or not, or whether we say, look, members, you board members and members of your groups, you see the criteria, you know what we're scoring on. Take all that into account, when you advocate for having a project being put into the TIP. So
I don't think I was calling for any additional metrics to be created or incorporated into TIP scoring.
No, I'm not saying you were, but that was that was something under other recommendations. And so it's the first point under other recommendations, which is the last slide in the deck. So yeah, there we go. I think you see it up there now. Actually, you had it up, Matt. Yeah. So yeah, I wasn't assigning that idea to you, John. It's just something that was listed. Andy?
Yeah, I think it seems like a pretty effective set of recommendations. I was actually curious because I was not able to review how the MPO meeting where this was brought forth. I was curious, Len, if you had some salient high points that would kind of maybe just help us process how these recommendations were, whether they were accepted as kind of, I'm assuming because they're out for release, they were accepted, but whether there was any concerns brought up in the conversation there.
Well, there was one really good suggestion I thought from Dan Amstutz, and that was that if we have to if there are cost increases, and we're going to ask the proponents to come before the board, that we really have a subcommittee or something, or ad hoc committee or something, to deal, for them to talk, for them to address, rather than having it as part of a board meeting. Because as you know, I mean, our board meetings are plenty long as it is, and I like that idea. Dave Marler certainly had some issues with the upper right quadrant, and so and he just asked one simple question, and that was the regardless of how much project costs, when the score is higher than an arbitrary level, it will always be in tier 2, or that upper right tier 2. And the answer to that is yes, which is an intriguing question. And kind of reminds me of a question, or something that came up in my early days on the appeal. I forget the member's name right now, but it was coming up. It came up in the part of discussion about how we allocate our funds across various programs, how we have a limitation on them, like maybe 30% you can only go to large infrastructure projects. And the thought question was, well, what if there was like this just incredible program that solved everything, and it took all the money for a given year, or maybe even set of years. Would we say, because that is above the threshold, would we not approve it? And so essentially, we said yes by not taking a vote to do something. So there was no motion, to say that we should consider that. But that's where a project like the super project would fit. But Dave Muller isn't a big fan of this quadrant, or this quadrant approach. And I think we're going to have some more discussion about that. And like I said, I think it's going to come down to where we draw the vertical line and the horizontal lines. And so whether or not we as a group say anything about that, please think about that. And if you want to convey anything to me at a later date, that's fine. I think the next meeting is going to be on the 21st. I don't know if it's on the agenda. It might very well be, because it'll be after the comment period. And just keep in mind the comment period is on the 18th. So I'm not, I guess what I'll say is, if anyone thinks that we should submit a letter, it's getting kind of late in the meeting, raise your hand. But raise your hand knowing that you're going to write the letter. And I hope you have enough of a framework from this conversation, and if multiple people raise hands, you'll have people helping you write the letter, but then the group will then have a quick vote to decide whether or not we are okay with that. Okay, no hands up. So cool. So that makes things simpler. And now we can move to the next part of the agenda. And from my recollection, it's going to be election discussion. And
you are correct, Len.
Yeah.
Just give me 1 second while
Sure.
I get back to the proper spot here. There we go. Or my computer could behave, that would be great. Okay, okay, not sure why it went back to that slide. Sorry. There we go. So we had perhaps the briefest election count, or any committee meeting, subcommittee meeting, I should say, discussing the election. And given that the current chair and vice chair expressed a high likelihood of running again in the upcoming election. The election council declined to nominate other individuals for those positions. However, at this meeting, should you be interested in entering yourself to run for one of those positions, you are more than welcome. So if anybody would like to nominate themselves, you are free to do so right now. And you could just raise your hand. And I'm seeing none. So I believe it is safe to say that Len Diggins and Scott Zedekis will be the nominees for the chair and vice chair positions respectively. And we will just need some statements from both of you. It could just be a brief paragraph prior to the next advisory council meeting.
And let me just make a promise now, that I will never do another one of these substitutions for Matt if Matt's available. So I'll only do them if Matt's not available, and you can always ask for someone else to do it. I actually did. I did read over it, to try to prepare more. But I wish I'd done better. But anyways, I hope you got something out of it.
You did a great job, Len. Don't beat yourself up.
All right, thanks. Chair's report. I'm sorry. I'm kind of losing my focus a little bit. I'm trying to remember. So we had that meeting. Well, we didn't have. We skipped a meeting. So I think it was that meeting where we released this, and it was a somewhat short meeting. So I don't really have anything to report out of that meeting. And yeah, I think that was it. Was there anything you remember, Matt Archer?
That was the major talking point of that meeting. I think that at the upcoming meeting, there will be significantly more to discuss. But yeah, I think that given the previous section of the meeting, you've covered the real meat of what was discussed at the MPO.
Yeah, and I was just so focused on that I forgot to go back and check. But yeah, we did the meeting on the 7th was canceled, and so presumably the next meeting is going to be on the 21st. And so old business, new business, member announcements. Well, after thinking that this meeting was going to run long, I get to give you 4 minutes back, but all right. Well, folks, thanks so much for joining, and gonna try and come up with some. Oh, actually, I think for the next meeting we're gonna have Am right? Tell us about the new LRTP.
That is the plan.
Yeah, well, that makes me excited, and hopefully does you too. So just think about that and come back to the next meeting. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.
Len, I apologize. Just if we could get a motion and a second to adjourn.
Yeah, that's fine. No, that's right. That's right. I'm just so used to being informal about this part of the
Motion to
process.
adjourn.
All right, we have a motion from Andy Reeker. And
Second.
Thank you very much, John. All right, sorry, Mr. Chair.
Oh, no. I'm fine. So I think the meeting's adjourned unless you want to take a vote, Matt.
I think just say without
Okay.
objection, we're adjourned.
Without objection, we're adjourned.
Nice work, Len.
Well, thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.